Station 3, complex sentences. In order to understand complex sentences, you need to understand an independent clause. It can stand all by itself as a complete sentence. A dependent clause cannot stand alone. Something about it leaves the sentence unfinished. Now, an independent clause may be a very short sentence, but it makes sense by itself. A dependent clause cannot stand alone, usually because it has something like a subordinating conjunction. In front of it. This subordinate conjunction will make it be an incomplete sentence. So let's walk through this. A dependent clause has a subject and predicate, but it is not a complete sentence. It depends on the independent clause to complete its meaning. So think about it this way. You, as students, depend on your parents to provide a house, clothing, food. Maybe some of you buy your own clothes a little bit, but for the most part, your parents provide those things for you. You could not do all of that on your own and still go to school like you're supposed to, like the law requires. So you are dependent upon your parents for the basic needs of life, the food, clothing, and shelter. And this sentence, or the dependent clause, is dependent on the remainder of the sentence to make sense. It needs more words. So it is dependent on the rest of the sentence. So, for example, an independent clause, we don't know, or we didn't know, either one. It works as a sentence by itself. Now, you may still have questions like you didn't know what and things like that, but that's just because we're taking the sentence in isolation away from the rest of the paragraph. By itself, though, we didn't know makes sense. It's complete. Subject, predicate, complete sense. A complete sentence. Dependent clause, that the paint was wet. That doesn't make sense by itself. You can't leave that as a sentence alone. Even if it were in the middle of a paragraph and you knew what was going on, it would still be considered a fragment because we didn't know what happened that the paint was wet. It doesn't make any sense. So let's look at a few examples. While Tom reads novels. This is your subordinate conjunction. While is a subordinate conjunction. And so because of that, while Tom reads novels, we're left wondering what happens while Tom reads novels. We don't know. We need the rest of the sentence in order for that to make sense. And yet we have Tom reads. That's a complete sentence. And actually, if I said Tom reads novels, that would be a complete sentence. But because you have the subordinate conjunction there, that means that this phrase is a dependent clause. Okay? Now, if I said Jack reads comics, you have a subject and you have a predicate, and it makes complete sense. We know what Jack reads. Jack reads comics. So it's an independent clause. Independent clause, I see. Then we have a conjunction. This is not a subordinate conjunction. This is one of the fanboys. So we look at that in isolation by itself. Sam reads only magazines. That is an independent clause. It makes sense. Sam reads only magazines. So altogether, independent clause, IC. And this is DC. We have, while Tom reads novels, Jack reads comics, but Sam only reads only magazines. Okay, that is a complex sentence because it's got a dependent clause and an independent clause and another independent clause. Okay. Now, Tom reads novels, comma, but Jack reads comics because books are too difficult. Tom reads novels. Makes sense all by itself, right? You've got a subject and a predicate, and it makes sense. So that is an independent clause. But is one of the fanboys. For, and, nor, but, or, yet, so. Those we don't count in the brackets. This funny scrolly thing is a bracket. Okay? So Jack reads comics. Is that a complete sentence? Yes, it is. So that is an independent clause. And then because books are too difficult. Because is not one of the fanboys. It's not for or because. Yeah, no. It's no. I can't do it out of order. For, and, nor, but, or, yet, so is what it is. So because is going to be a conjunction here. I don't know if it's subordinate conjunction. I'll have to look it up. But anyhow, because books are too difficult does not make sense as a sentence all by itself. So that means it is a dependent clause, DC. So here we have IC, DC. Both of these are complex sentences. It doesn't matter if you have DC first or DC last, or IC first or IC last. The order doesn't matter. The fact is that you're mixing dependent clauses and independent clauses. Okay? Now we get into some more complicated stuff. Yeah. Jack rarely reads novels. If you read it just like that, it's an independent clause. Jack rarely reads novels. This is interrupted by this phrase, this dependent clause. Who reads comics? Who reads comics all by itself does not make sense. DC. It's a dependent clause. It depends on the rest of the sentence to make sense. Now, you're not going to see this kind of thing on a test, but you probably need to know, how this works. So, Jack, comma, dependent clause, comma. When you see those two commas offsetting a phrase like this, as long as it's not a list, this means that part can be removed and it'll still make sense. So, Jack rarely reads novels. This is an independent clause. If you include the Jack there, and we should, because removing this would leave us with an independent clause. Okay. Semicolon is an indicator that you are going to have a complete sentence before it and a complete sentence after it. Okay. And it ties them together. It means that these two sentences are so closely related and connected to each other, like a cause and effect type of thing, that we don't want to separate it. We could write them completely separate, but in this particular case, because it's, this one is actually comparing, so we want to connect it together because of the comparison. However, Tom enjoys novels. Tom enjoys novels is an independent clause. Okay? And we will learn more about this semicolon next semester. We're going to be hitting punctuation pretty hard next semester. In here, we have people who read comics, rarely read novels, often find books difficult. Okay? You have a dependent clause, an independent clause, and an independent clause. And I'm running out of recording time, so let me stop this. And I'll do the examples next video.